I'm going to turn it over to Brett, who has been the tip of the spear with regard to overseeing and trying to manage the Main Bow intersection project. I would just like to, am I saying this or are you?
Go ahead.
All right, I'll say it. I would just like to recognize that while Brett is on camera and the face and planning has been in the bright vests, that our public works and public safety teams have been really working diligently behind the scenes and working hard to try to make this project a success. So.
Hey everybody, thanks Sophie. Brett Richardson, Development Director. We got a good positive update tonight. We've learned a lot, and to sort of echo what Sophie said, one of the things that we've learned is that even quick build trials are not simple. They're not easy. We've learned a lot, and frankly, through that process, Earl and his team have invested a tremendous amount of time to respond to some of the issues. Nate Goodman, the chief of police, and his team have been a really good conduit for information and feedback. Visit Freeport has done a nice job reaching out to the tour buses to help them understand what we're trying to do. So we just wanted to really make sure that it was clearly stated that this has been an interesting process. We've learned a lot, and it's been a good effort on Earl's part and his team. So next slide, if we could. Real quick, I'm going to share some updates on the data that we found. Before we do that, I want to remind folks of how we got here. And it all started back in 2022 with the downtown vision and the concept that came out of that from the principal group that you'll see on the inset there on the left, the idea to slow down the intersection, create some more placemaking opportunities. And then this bigger vision here with this pretty picture with that intersection tightened up, pedestrian crossings much tighter and shorter and safer, more public space, street trees. That's a fresh iteration from June that Jeff Speck drew as a follow-up to the presentation that he did in June at the Performing Arts Center. So the idea here is this idea has been in the works for a while. We've been working on it and refining it behind the scenes, and this trial that we saw today is out in Main and Bow today is really an experiment to test that and learn from that. So if we can do the next one. We started working on this coming out of that presentation in June, and the first idea that came from Stantec was really a transformative demonstration project. It was about putting barriers in the road that allowed the public space to be activated, tight intersection that was a little bit different than what we saw on the ground. But because by the time we got to this, it was August, we know that the snow starts to fly, later in the fall and in the winter. And then it was a big lift for Earl and his team that it was deemed a little bit too complex to do on a short term that would have to be removed after 8 to 10 weeks. So we got the directive then to come back with the desire to do something quicker and simple that we could execute this fall. And so what we came back with input from DOT was a quick build concept that didn't use barriers. It used the posts that you see out in the intersection today, delineators, a little bit different configuration that we learned a lot from. For example, if you can see, the space that was reclaimed at Bow and Main was in the middle of the lane from Bow heading on to Main, whereas the Stantec design actually had the traffic moving in that lane. And so if you think about some of the big vehicle traffic that had issues early on, had we used that middle lane with the big vehicles, the right-hand turn would have been much more manageable. So through the process of going from the original vision to the quick hitter hybrid that you see out today, we uncovered some issues and we discovered some of the value in the original design. So we learned a lot, but we think that we've got a good learning that we can build on and going into the future. And it's important to note that this trial that you see was not designed to be everything that the communities wished for. It was really a simple experiment to test whether traffic continued to flow with an all-way stop. So that was the goal that we were focused on. And the way we measured that was the number of queues for cars, how many cars lined up. And that was a sort of an understanding of how traffic was flowing. If cars backed up more with the always stop than they backed up without an always stop, then we could determine the impact on traffic. So that was the measuring stick, was how many cars would back up. We did a pre-trial count for a couple of weeks before the installation, and then we've been counting ever since then, including over the weekend here with the Fall Festival when the traffic was in town. And so that was a really interesting thing to observe how this intersection performed relative to the corridor as a whole. So that's how we measured. As I mentioned, we identified some issues, and Earl and his team, with input from a bunch of stakeholders, really were out there almost daily. As these issues were uncovered, they were out there making changes, moving things around, opening things up. The turning radius for large vehicles, it wasn't there. The visual clutter and pedestrian visibility that we hear about, those posts are, equipment-wise, relatively inexpensive. DOT provided them. But if you are a resident in town that hasn't been following this, and you see those posts, there's a reality to it, that they are a little bit confusing. They're not beautiful. They are at eye view, sort of, if you're in a car. And so some of the trial equipment that we used results in the perception of visual clutter. And it's important to note that going forward, as we look at this intersection, that if we were to do it again, it would be different materials and that clutter wouldn't be there like that. So that's something to note too. And then public safety, access, and passage. This was a conversation that we had the last time we reported out, was concerns about public safety vehicles being able to navigate the corridor. We've continued to stay in touch with our public safety, fire chief, and police chief, and they continue to see no real public safety risk with this. We're seeing public safety vehicles being able to navigate it. And I think what I've heard is that the Fall Festival this weekend harkened back to the prime time, of Freeport back in the day when that was a normal summer day to have that many people in town. And my understanding is that the public safety facilities and the through routes for the vehicles were in the same place then as they are now. And so it's a pretty good understanding from our police chief and fire chief that we can work with this. And we made some improvements to help with throughput. So the other part that we've learned a lot about is the bus parking and just how important that is and how tricky it is to communicate out to all the various commercial tour buses with a relatively short turnaround time and a lot of ingrained habits. And they're used to doing things a certain way. And so Visit Freeport has been a great partner to get the word out. But we've also learned that that's a really important asset to the community to have these tour buses coming in, and that we need to pay close attention to that going forward. Pre-trial data collection, we looked at a couple times a day from each approach at the intersection. So southbound on Route 1 as folks approach the intersection, northbound, and then from Bow onto Main. We counted for 15 minutes. We counted the folks' pedestrian crossings because that interrupts traffic. We also counted the number of turns, vehicles making a left-hand turn because that impacts traffic. And then we counted the instances of 2, 3, 4, and 5 or more vehicles. Did that on a routine basis so we could see changes over time. Next one, Sophie, please. Here's the data. This is what we came up with. 11 a.m., 2 p.m., 3 p.m. It's important to note that we've sort of validated what I think many folks in town know is that roughly from 2:25 to 2:45 every day when the schools get out, that results in a fair amount of traffic. But we can see that over time, the pre-test generated, 3 to 5 two-car queues in a 15-minute window. So if you think about that, that's a car queue about every 3 minutes, right? 4 cars, 5 cars, it was a little bit lower. We've seen an uptick with the post, with the installation in. It's actually gone up a little bit more recently, and that could be to do with the traffic coming off of Mallet and the construction work there. It could be to do with the increased bus traffic and the influx of folks that we now see in the fall. But it's also important to note that what we're seeing from 2 to 5 cars, if you add those numbers up across, it's about 15 queues in a 15-minute period. So we're getting about 1 queue a minute, right? And they clear pretty quickly. And so we had a Village Corridor Initiative leadership team last week Public Works, DOT, Stantec, Complete Streets, Town Council members who have been thinking about this, and essentially everybody unanimously came to the conclusion that, I think we can go to the next one, that this trial has essentially worked from the sense that it hasn't dramatically or significantly degraded traffic flow. We're still seeing quality movement through the corridor. We found that there's some issues that we uncovered with the hybrid quick build that I talked about a little bit earlier. We feel pretty confident that the issues have been mitigated during the trial. Not perfect, but we've taken steps to mitigate it. We've learned a lot, and with a time to design, we can eliminate those going forward. We can make sure that the buses have space to use where they need to go. We can make sure that we configure the lanes in a way that big vehicles can make the turn. And we can get rid of some of that visual clutter with different materials so that it's much more open and visible and less confusing for folks, as well as doubling down to make sure that the public safety vehicles have all the access that they need. One thing that's of note is that the flow from Bow Street onto Main, from the data that we've seen, is actually improved. I know there were a fair amount of folks that were really concerned that that's their sort of way to get into town. Because they now have a stop sign and folks stopping either way, they have a natural path and they don't have to be as aggressive or sort of, to try to force their way out into the lane. So that's been a positive. I want to say one more time that these trials, even if we do a quick build, it takes a lot of staff time and effort to pull it off and adjust and to learn and to grow together. And then probably most importantly at this point, because we've determined that from DOT's perspective, Stantec's perspective, the leadership team's perspective, that this has essentially been a positive to build on, that we've also learned as much as we're going to learn from the current trial. There's not much more that we can learn this fall. So I know Earl has a plan next Tuesday to pull the parklet out on 10/14. And I just want to put that in front of you guys, that we've learned as much as we can learn from this trial. That's what I have to share tonight. So I'd love to answer any questions.
So if I'm reading between the lines, are you suggesting we think about removing the three-way stop on the 14th?
I think it's worthy of consideration.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Any questions for Brett? Councilor Brown?
Could you go back a couple of slides?
For you, Councilor Brown, I can do it.
That actually, one forward. Yeah, that one. So just to be clear, 15-minute intervals means, for instance, start at 11, end at 11:15?
Correct.
So-
At one, so to follow your example, standing in front of Linda Bean's restaurant, focusing on the traffic on Bow, approaching Main for 15 minutes.
Okay.
Then moving to the next spot, 15 minutes, moving to the next spot.
Oh, for a total of 45 minutes?
Correct. Yep.
I see. So you are through the period, for instance, starting at 2, that's the most complicated, because the value of the most complicated is to really pay attention to safety and emergency vehicles and how they get through, and what's the negotiation that takes place when there's reduced ability to do that, seemingly. And I know I get the sense that it's working, and yet I feel the notion of emergency vehicle pass-through, especially ambulances, needs to be applied in a weighted average sort of way. In other words, if you or I have a heart attack, I'm making my point. I mean, it's really important that we get this right. So that's my observation.
It's a valid point. I want to really highlight something. This is probably small for you guys, but this festival, the pedestrian crossings were 3 times the average. I mean, that was busy. And from my experience coming into town, traffic northbound on Mallet was backed up to Justin's Way consistently, if not to Main Street, right? And even with that fact, and if you think about what the implications of that means, northbound can't move because there's nowhere to go. Bow and Main can't turn because there's nowhere to go. The increase in queues was pretty minimal, right? I mean, we sent an update to the village leadership team, and the feedback was Bow and Main was arguably the intersection that was working the best under that condition, and that the School Street intersection was quite problematic. So I think I think the festival over the weekend is a pretty good proxy for what peak summer traffic looks like. And I was very interested, and I came up on a Saturday to observe it for that reason, to make sure that I could speak knowledgeably to you all. And it really gave me more confidence in the overall finding of the leadership team from the week before, that with a straight face, I can say that this passed the test of whether or not an all-way stop works from a traffic standpoint.
Brett, on that, can you explain pre and post, if you look at the pedestrian cross events, why is it at 3 p.m. like half from pre to post?
You know, that's a good question. That's a good question. I think it's actually, you know, the post is actually fairly consistent.
So I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
But the pre was taking place right as we were experiencing an uptick at the end of summer. We had school shoppers and stuff here. It was that last kind of 2 weeks.
2 weeks of August.
August.
Yep.
And then it kind of has gone down quite a bit. We've seen weekends where it's come up, but not weekdays. It hasn't been like that.
It's true.
Did we have metrics that we had going into this about what would have been successful versus not successful in terms of other data?
The simple for this project approach was to count car queues, and that was recommended by Stantec and DOT. So this is a new world for me, but I trust that they did it right. I think, you know, part of the conversation that we had back in August was we may want to do a full trial, the full demonstration build out in the spring to make sure that we understand what's happening in the spring and the summer, but we wanted to do something simple and quick this fall. And so I think if the council has an appetite to follow through on that and to continue forward, evaluating this as an option, that we would have a period of time, a longer period of time, to have a much more robust view on how this all fits together. So we're talking about, you know, putting the wires across the road that car tires go over and we get counts. We're talking about a more robust drone and video footage. We're talking about engaging with more lead time, our partners at DOT and PACS and GPCOG, to have access to that equipment that they've already committed months in advance. And so this, admittedly, is a fairly simple, but I think valid, study. With lead time, we can add more to it to get more granular data.
So this basically is showing that the queues weren't so bad that we should stop.
Exactly. Yep, it passed that test. It did not seriously degrade traffic.
Are we, if we roll this out for another pilot in the spring, are we going to would we expand the assessment to include other intersections along Main Street? And has the topic been brought up about looking at the number of pedestrian crossings we have and potentially moving some of them, or if some of them maybe aren't needed? I'm just wondering if that's even been a discussion point.
It was discussed at the leadership team meeting, and I encourage Councilor Smith or Councilor Pitch to weigh in, but essentially I think Stantec is going to look at that northern end of the corridor, perhaps south as well, and consider different traffic controls for those intersections, including Mallet and Main. They made the argument that it's worth looking at converting that intersection to an all-way stop to see if that keeps people moving. Because what you see when the light changes, it just piles up, 20 cars, right? And then the light changes and it clears. But there may be a way to have a moderately slower, if you were driving up to Mallet and you didn't hit the light and you had to sit there, that's a lot different than if you did hit the light, right? So your experience could be different over time, but over an average, an always stop might feel slower at first, but it's worth looking at to see if that actually over time moves faster and is more fluid, and also helps the pedestrian safety there at that intersection that we hear about school kids going to the library, and it's worth looking at. So The benefit of this is that we learned a lot in a high visibility situation, and we now have an opportunity to pause, take a breath, and look at the corridor based on what we learned.
I would reiterate much of what you just said, Brett, in terms of looking at those other intersections. At the Village Corridor Initiative leadership team meeting, we did have an extensive conversation about the fact that this is really not even necessarily the intersection of most concern for a lot of people, including members of that team, including a lot of the members of the public that we have heard feedback from throughout this test. And I think, first of all, in order to go ahead with a larger scale pilot, we would need to look critically to make sure that it was taking into account all of the learnings and that some of the additional benefit of that reclaimed space might be evident, visible, but also that the visual noise that Brett talked about would be less evident, that it would really be designed in a way that would be much closer to the eventual potential reality. But also, I think that having learned what we could learn from this test, I think what we've learned is also limited without further tests on those other intersections. And so it's one thing to say that traffic is still moving with a three-way stop at Main and Bow. Can we demonstrate or test that that continues to be the case if we address the issue of Elm and School and Main? And then Mallet. And I think there is a general consensus that the intersection in Mallet is really the key issue to tackle because that impacts all of these other intersections when that backs up. But I think there is, what we've certainly heard from a number of residents is that they are concerned, regardless of what happens with Main and Bow, is that the School Street and Elm Street intersection is really the next thing to tackle in addition to Mallet.
That's 100% what I heard too, and it's validated in the current draft current conditions report that we saw, which highlighted that intersection, School and Elm, as a high crash zone. From a DOT standpoint, that's a hotspot. So people's experience is validated by the data.
And I would just add that MDOT obviously is the key partner in all of this, along with Freeport Public Works. But MDOT is 100% on the same page about the need to address School, Elm, and Main, and Mallet as well. They understand that those are all issues.
I just want to chime in with a brief reminder that the first slide you showed, the vision that prompted all this, wasn't how many stop signs can we put on Main Street. It was what can we do to generate a sense of place? What can we do about fixing this tiny little sidewalk in front of Patagonia? What can we do to recreate a town square and have it be a destination? So those are really the larger goals. You know, whether or not we wind up with a stop sign there or not, you know, that's a byproduct. That's not the main thing that we want to test.
That's right.
So in reference to the 14th, do any counselors have an idea of if they would prefer to keep the trial going or remove it now?
I think the last point on the last slide was we've learned all we can learn. You know, there's no point in keep prolonging it.
I would also just add, I think that was generally the plan was mid-October for that to come up, with the possibility that it could come up sooner if the weather changed. And although we did have an incredibly warm weekend, I think that is all changing tomorrow. And I'm looking at Earl thinking that probably Earl's team would like to move forward sooner than later so that we don't have a rush to do it.
Earl, is that correct? Okay.
And just to make a key point too, DOT confirmed yesterday that we have enough data. They're satisfied with what we've done.
Can I just make the plug that we should be forward-thinking as to what we may do in the spring and message it at the same time as we say, hey, we're taking this down, because I think the last thing we want is to then implement changes in the spring and have people say, what are you doing? Where'd this come from? I thought we were done with this. Like, I think people need to understand the whole continuum of what we're looking at.
Right, and also I think that removing it isn't because of failure, it's because we're done with this phase. Yeah.
And you might want to iterate that it is traffic calming and trying to reclaim some of the sidewalk, because that's what we're trying to do. That's, I got a couple emails as well, that it's not broke, don't fix it, and it's, well,
Right.
this is what we're trying to do. It's not,
Right, and the end goal, as Councilor Pilch said, could be very different. Yeah, or end use, end product, yep.
I think one option for that continued messaging would be to update, but keep the placement of the explanatory signs on the sidewalk. However, I realize that the people who are reading those are probably the pedestrians, not the drivers. So I think, obviously, messaging in all the other places we have messaged it, including the website. Although I don't know how many people will actually proactively look for that update.
Put a
So-
banner, thank you for your patience, test over.
If we
Phase two
allowed
will come.
temporary signs on Main Street, then we could do that, but we do not.
We could put one up till somebody takes it down, but.
That would be Earl, probably. All right, that sounds good. I think we agree. Go ahead and take it
Thank you,
down
Brett.
next week, and thank you, Brett.